All right, guys, well, welcome back. We're going to cover the next two chapters in Into the Wild, and that's going to be chapters 14 and 15, which really are chapters that are built around our author and how he connects personally to the protagonist. It's not really a protagonist in the way this novel's set up, but anyway, how he connects with Chris McCandless. These chapters are really important for a couple of reasons. One, it allows him to kind of work his purpose and his main idea here into, especially in chapter 15, near the end, we're really going to see that. But it also allows a doorway for us as readers to connect. Because even though, I would imagine nobody in our class are really the most out, as far as outdoors, like would move out into the wild and type of things. Now, I lived on the Appalachian Trail for a while and worked on it, so I definitely feel this. So it allows me to connect, and I'm hoping in some ways it does with you guys too. So let's look at a few of the important points. Now, remember, you need to do the reading. All right, I'm not going to hit everything. I'm not going to go over all the stuff that happens. I just want you to see some of the high points and some of the stuff we would discuss in class, okay? So we start off with, again, our typical quotes. I'm not sure if there's either of these that were really important, but we start out with, we're still talking about McCandless, all right? And we get actually the title of the book, where it came from. Let's read the very beginning. It says, in the final postcard he sent to Wayne Westerberg, McCandless had written, "If this adventure proves fatal and you don't ever hear from me again, I want you to know you're a great man. I now walk into the wild." So that's where the term came from. And, a lot of people reading that thought that maybe that was kind of like a suicide note. It sounds like a final goodbye. But, this is where Krakauer starts to take a little bit more of a, putting himself into his novel. And he points out that he doesn't think that's the case. He doesn't think McCandless was doing that. There's a lot of reasons to think he was, by the way. But, or at least he didn't care if he died. Let's just say it that way. But this is where Krakauer starts to make the connections where he's similar. So let's look at this paragraph on page 134. As a youth, I am told I was willful, self-absorbed, intermittently reckless, moody. I disappointed my father in the usual ways. Like McCandless, figures of male authority aroused in me a confusing medley of court fury and hunger to please. If something captured my undisciplined imagination, I pursued it with a zeal bordering on obsession. And from the age of 17 until my late 20s, that something was mountain climbing. All right, just that one paragraph shows lots of parallels with McCandless and kind of gives you a clue of where this is going. All right? Everything with the mountain climbing, and McCandless's was hiking and being out in the wilderness, but his is mountain climbing in the wilderness. So really there's a lot of similarity. All right. He points out that he's about the same age as McCandless when he made his big, his moment. Now, we are going to see that Krakauer, on the other hand, kind of makes peace with his past and is able to move on, while McCandless was robbed of that opportunity. This definitely sounds McCandless on page 136. He says, I was surprised, as always, by how easy the act of leaving was and how good it felt. The world was suddenly rich with possibility. See, that's how you can detect a kind of kinship with Krakauer and McCandless. This idea that you realize how good it feels to leave. Now, not all of us have that. I don't. When I leave an area or leave a group or leave some people, I don't feel good about it. It's painful for me. So I'm not like them in that. But a lot of people it is. It's that moving on and realizing you've got this wide open, who knows where you're going to go next. All right. So he talks about getting to Alaska, where he's going to go climb this mountain and really feeling unsure of what's going to happen because he's doing it solo. So like on 137, he says, I was at a loss for what to do next. I took refuge under the eaves of the town library and sat on my load. So in other words, he's just like, I know where I'm going. I just don't really getting there. It becomes, it's easy when it's up here. Getting the actual planning out and doing it is a whole different battle. He says, I confessed my climbing plans to her. He's talking about this girl he met. Her name is Kai. And to my relief, she neither laughed nor acted as though they were particularly strange. And skipping it down a little more, he says, I had convinced myself for many months I didn't really mind the absence of intimacy in my life, the lack of real human connection, but the pleasure I'd felt in this woman's company, the ring of her laughter, the innocent touch of a hand on my arm, exposed my self-deceit and left me hollow and aching. Now, this is the power of reflection. He can look back and realize that, like McCandless, he thought he was immune to, human intimacy, but he sees now that he wasn't. He realizes now in the aftermath how much he really, missed people. We can think we're an island and we don't need people, and I have my moments where I'm that way, but the truth is that that's just not who most of us are. Great line on 138. He's talking about going, on this pathway up to this mountain. And he says, because I was alone, however, even the mundane seemed charged with meaning. And I love that. I love the power of being alone, where all of a sudden we start reflecting and things start to, start turning up here. When in real life, we don't do that very often, sadly. We're not the most reflective of people. We're filled with noise everywhere that prevents us really from being the reflective people we should be. Let me move my mic a little closer. Sorry. Hopefully this is all picking up. He talks also about how this being alone, his emotions are amplified. Again, something that's very common about being alone that we should probably, relish and we should take advantage of. This is one of the great things about nature is it gives us this opportunity to be reflective and to spend time, even if you're not alone, even if you're with people, but it's just such a great bonding element. It's one of the worst things about civilization that we've locked ourselves into these, family homes where, we just interact with our family and that's it. And we don't really interact with them. We're all living. I've got 4 people that live in my house, and we all 4 are living our own little lives within that house, Each of my kids are in their bedrooms doing whatever they're doing. I may be sitting out in the den watching TV. My wife's in the back in our bedroom watching TV, and none of us are interacting. So, being out in the wild, that's just not how it works. Even if you're with a group, you kind of interact, and there's so much more sharing and participating in, a shared experience instead of individual ones. So, all right, I could get off on a whole separate tangent here, so we'll skip ahead a little bit. Let's see, what else do we have in here? I know that his climbing the mountain, for the most part, at least in chapter 14, the one we start with, it meets with failure over and over. He has problems with getting supplies dropped off. There's a lot of detail here, which of course there would be. This is the author telling his story, so he's not having to piece together things from other people's stories. This is him, so it's much easier to get a lot more detail. And this is some of the best writing in the book. Okay, when I first read this, I really didn't like chapters 14 and 15 because I felt like this was Krakauer, just like, hey, look at me. But I honestly feel like he's showing this kinship with McCandless, and his best writing is found in these because he's writing himself. He's writing about what he knows. All right, let's see. There's a lot of things I've highlighted in here that I'm not going to read, but that I'd love to share with you guys when I'm back in class. So, okay, here's a good one on page 143. He says, at such moments, something resembling happiness actually stirs in your chest, but it isn't the sort of emotion you want to lean on very hard. That is something that I spent a lot of time talking about last time I taught this, the idea that you don't want to trust happiness too much. And I think there's a really smart point to that. Happiness is great. We want to be happy, and I would like everyone to be happy. But the fact is that you have to be careful. Happiness is often very, transitory. It doesn't last. That excitement that you have about something will fade, and then there's the aftermath, the dealing with it. So happiness is great, but we don't want to put too much, like he said, you don't want to depend on it too much. An ant on my desk. You don't want to depend on happiness as, this is going to be where I make my decisions. It's one of the things that Stoics that mastered was that, you want to avoid making decisions when you're charged in any emotional way, whether you're sad or you're angry or you're happy. Usually decisions we make at extreme emotions tend to be bad ones. So I think that's kind of what he's pointing to here. Continue. So that kind of ends 14. I'm trying to see. I don't think he gets to the top. No, he doesn't. He says the climb was over. The only place to go was down. I don't think. I think it's 15 where he finally climbed. I just read these and reviewed them for you guys, and now I'm still stuck. So let's look at 15. 15's another. It's kind of goes along with it. Yeah, he hasn't made it up yet. So let's look at page 146. He says, the thought of returning to Boulder in defeat wasn't very appealing either. I could all too easily picture the smug expression of condolence I'd receive from those who'd been certain of my failure from the get-go. So here we have where his pride is what's making him want to climb. He doesn't even want to climb the mountain at this point, guys. But it's one of those things where I told people I was going to do it, and if I don't, they're going to think I'm a failure. And, we've got whatever our pride is, wherever we find it, we have a hard time letting go of it. So even on the next thing, and he starts talking about his relationship with his father, which is very tragic, to be honest with you. We don't get much about McCandless's relationship. We get some. We know little pieces, but Krakauer tells us about his relationship with his dad, and it is much more of a tragic story from what I've seen. On 147, he says, I had a knack of living up to the old man's worst expectations, which, again, that's how so many teenagers feel, sadly. He says, my father was volatile, extremely complicated person, possessed of a brash demeanor that masked deep insecurity. That sentence right there tells you his dad's probably not the greatest person, but he's trying to make it sound like he is. All right, volatile is a very charged word. When you say someone's extremely complicated, that means that you love them, but it's what comes after that but that's always the issue. Brash demeanor, that's not a positive connotation. Deep insecurities is obviously not. He says if he ever admitted in his life to being wrong, I wasn't there to witness it. So, that tells you a lot about his dad. But then in the next stanza, I'm doing poetry. In the next paragraph, he says, a kind and generous man, Louis Krakauer loved his 5 children deeply in the autocratic way of fathers, but his worldview was colored by a relentlessly competitive nature. Life as he saw it was a contest. So at that point, you get this fact that he does love his dad, and his dad loved them, but he's just a flawed person, which, hey, aren't we all, okay? The next page, he talks about his dad, wanting to lay out this path for him. Same thing we saw with McCandless, okay? But he says, I was not a clone of my father. He realized, his dad doesn't realize that I'm just not, I don't want your life. I don't want to be like you. Which, as parents, we hate that. We really hate hearing that. I hope my children grow up and do what they love. But, I don't want them to, abandon principles I've taught them. And my principles that I've taught my kids aren't about you need to do this job. But a lot of parents, that's the case. If your kid's smart, you want them to become a doctor or a lawyer, which is exactly the 2 things that Krakauer's dad wanted him to become. But, mine's never been that. Mine's more about our beliefs and the things we hold dear, our values. And I want my kids to hold those too. Fact is that they're going to have their own opinions and their own values, and they may alter them some, and that's totally fine. He points out that his dad gave him a lot of freedom, and he was able to really explore who he wanted to be. But of course he did this tip. I told you guys in the last video that teenagers and their parents fighting is just the way it goes. It's the way of the world. It's what helps us to break away. It's the whole pushing someone out of the nest kind of. But he talks about, unlike McCandless, who had the same issues with his dad, look at the bottom of page 148. He says, 2 decades after the fact, I discovered that my rage was gone and had been for years. See, McCandless doesn't have that time for that rage to mellow and realize that anger you have at your parents is really a temporary thing for the most part, and then it's something that fades. He says it had been supplanted by a rueful sympathy and something not unlike affection. It's he begins to pity his dad and even, love him because he realizes, I'm a grown person. This person is now not my caretaker, and I see who they really are. And you've lived enough to realize your own flaws, hopefully. So I came to understand that I had baffled and infuriated my father at least as much as he had baffled and infuriated me. He says I realized that this distance is both of us made it. It's not one. I saw that I had been selfish and unbending and a giant pain in the, he built a bridge of privilege for me, a hand-paved trestle to the good life, and I repaid him by chopping it down and crapping on the wreckage. What a great sentence. So he talks about how, as a parent, he realized finally, he saw it from his dad's perspective. He ended up, having that level of I don't want to say empathy. I don't think that's the word I'm looking for. But he was able to see it from his dad's perspective, okay? Being able to move past his own selfish views. But as this happens, his dad starts to decline. He starts to get involved with drug use, not like hardcore drug use, but, with pills and stuff, and he eventually ends up becoming more and more addicted to his drugs. And then on page 149, you get this paragraph, which is really sad. It says, as his behavior became more and more irrational, more and more delusional, the last of his friends were driven away. My long-suffering mother finally had no choice but to move out. My father crossed the line into madness and then very nearly succeeded in taking his own life, an act at which he made sure I was present. So what a very short but just powerful emotional passage where his dad has finally become legitimately, mentally having mental issues. And, the drugs becoming so bad he tries to kill himself. And not only does he try to kill himself, he wants to make sure his son sees it. That's a different thing, all in all. All right? His dad doesn't commit suicide, but, he ends up having a really rough life, judging by the next paragraph there. He ends up in a psychiatric hospital, all sorts of bad. But here's where you start to see some of the reflective nature of this book that I love. And this is where I think that as readers, we can get something from this. Now, you guys are still young, maybe not yet, but later. But this paragraph is important. He says, there was another irony that he's talking about his dad, failed to appreciate. His struggle to mold me in his image had been successful after all. The old walrus, in fact, managed to instill in me a great and burning ambition. It had simply found expression in an unintended pursuit. He never understood that the devil's thumb was the same as medical school, only different. See, that's the thing. A lot of the times as a parent, and one day most of you will be as well, you have to realize that even if your kids don't walk down the path that you laid out for them and you think they should, that in a lot of ways you're still going to have an impact on them. And it may not be in the way you thought, and it may not show up in the ways you thought, but that responsibility is a big one. All right. He's going to talk more about that in a minute. But he does talk about how at 23 he was stupid and didn't think about, what could happen, which that's just young people, think they're invincible. Same thing that happened with McCandless. And then, okay, so finally he decides to go ahead and go through with the climb. He does make it to the top of the mountain. He pulls it off, and this guy's is a monumental, endeavor he has undertaken, something that very few people can say they did, and he did it. So he says, fittingly, the summit was a surreal, malevolent place, an improbably slender wedge of rock and rime, no wider than a file cabinet. Here's the funny thing about it. He gets to the top. He's able to say he did it. It's really not worth it. So many of these big events that we build our lives around, that I'm going to achieve this goal, sometimes usually aren't what we expect. And so when we blow it out and we give all of our effort to it, we burn bridges to get there, that's kind of a problem. Now, that's not something Krakow was trying to point out. That's just a side note from Mr. Morris. All right, turn over to page 155. This will be the last little bit we talk about. We're getting up on a little bit over 15 minutes here. And this is the part that definitely I feel like can connect to readers. 155, he says, it is easy when you're young to believe that what you desire is no less than what you deserve, to assume that if you want something badly enough, it is your God-given right to have it. Okay, so welcome to the way a lot of you think. All right, if I try hard enough and if I really, really want it, then I deserve it. He said, when I decided to go to Alaska that April, like Chris McCandless, I was a raw youth who mistook passion for insight and acted according to an obscure, gap-ridden logic. He says, again, it's great that as a young person you have tons of passion, but it does need to be tempered and to realize that sometimes things just don't go the way we want and the way we think they should. All right? He says, I thought climbing the Devil's Thumb would fix all that was wrong with my life. In the end, of course, it changed almost nothing. But I came to appreciate that mountains make poor receptacles for dreams, and I lived to tell my tale. That's some of the great writing that I love from Krakauer. And then this, as a young man, I was unlike McCandless in many important regards. Most notably, I possessed neither his intellect nor his lofty ideals. But I believe we were similarly affected by skewed relationships we had with our fathers. And I suspect we had a similar intensity, a similar heedlessness, a similar agitation of the soul. That term, agitation of the soul, is the one I think that speaks. I mean, a lot of you have really good relationships with your parents, so that doesn't fit with you. Some of you may have a little bit more rocky ones, so you feel that. But that agitation of the soul, such a strong phrasing, the idea that there's just this restlessness in us where we feel like we need to do something. And a few of you don't have that. I think most of you do, in different ways. All right, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how you deal with that as you get older. Some of you are going to submit and just go along with conforming to what you feel like your life should be, and that's fine. You can live a very happy life that way. Some of you are going to do something else, and you're going to risk it big on something. Maybe not mountain climbing, but something else. And some of you are going to achieve those things, and you're going to do amazing things. Some of you are going to reach out, and you're not going to get there, and that's okay too. I mean, we learn in the failures more than we do in the successes, to be honest with you. So what happened here, he achieved his climb. He realizes it wasn't really worth it, but it does more for him than that. And of course, there's this just maturing that for some reason we've pushed the stage of maturity later and later and later and later each generation. I mean, he's like becoming mature here like 24 or 25, which you should have mastered it by then. I think I was like 27 or 28, to be honest with you. I think getting married is what finally matured me. So, yeah, these two chapters were two that I hated at once upon a time, but I actually really like now. And I hope you enjoyed them. Probably a lot of you, when you read it the first time, thought the same thing I did, like, oh, look at Krakauer, thinking we need to read his life. This book isn't about him, it's about Chris McCandless. But the McCandless story is to set up a bigger picture thing, okay? This isn't just a story about Chris McCandless. It's about, this agitation of the soul that so many of us have, and what to do with it, and how we handle relationships with others, and how we deal with the other, people that are different. And that's what your essay you're writing for me is going to be really about. How do we deal with people who are different than us? So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I love talking about these two chapters. I enjoyed making this video more than I did the last one, to be honest with you. So I hope it was useful for you. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to go make a video for my AP 12 class. So it'll be the last one I have to make before I go out. So I hope everything is good. I hope you guys have a great week without me, and I hope that we'll be back together soon. So anyway, have a great night.